V'chayavin b'tfilah. Why? Dirachmeininu. They are obligated in Tefilah because Tefilah involves asking for mercy from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Tefilah is not just simply an act, a regular mitzvah. We're turning to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We're asking Him to help us. We're asking. It's part of having a relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And therefore, says the Gemara, that's why they're obligated. Continues the Gemara. Mahu detema. Why would I have thought otherwise? Meaning that makes sense. Tefilah is about a connection with Hashem, davening to Hashem for mercy. So why would they not be obligated? Says the Gemara, Mahu detema. What would I have thought? Hoil v'katuv ba erev v'avoker v'tzaharayim. Since, as we know, in Tehillim, when David HaMelech describes Tefilah, he describes it as something that is done 3 times a day, morning, evening, then morning, then afternoon. Kim mitzvat aseh shazman gramadami. Because there are 3 times when a person is meant to daven, 3 specific times, at least as described in that pasuk. Maybe this should fall under the category of mitzvah haseh shazman grama, positive commandments that are time-bound, which, as we know, women are generally patur from. Answers the Gemara, kamash malan. We learn from here that actually they are obligated. Okay? So says the Gemara, I might have thought to say that they should be patur, that they should be exempt. Why should they be exempt? They should be exempt because this is a time-bound mitzvah that is positive, and women are generally not obligated in positive time-bound mitzvot. Kamash b'lan that they are. Comes our Mishnah teaches that they are obligated. Now there's a very interesting and a very fascinating machloket in the commentaries. What exactly is the conclusion of the Gemara here? Okay, this is an important methodological point. We're going to do a little bit of learning how to learn Gemara today. Okay, the Gemara here has what's called a hava amina. A hava amina is an initial thought, and then the Gemara has what's called a maskana, a conclusion. What's the initial thought? The initial thought was, since Tefilah has certain times that you're supposed to daven, therefore it should be considered a time-bound mitzvah, and women should be patur. Comes the Gemara to conclude they're obligated. Now, whenever you have a hava amina and a maskana, there's two ways that you can understand this conclusion. Either the conclusion is what we would call rejecting the hava amina, that the hava amina, our initial thought, was totally wrong, or no, it's what we would call a modification. It's not, in the end, our initial thought is somewhat correct. We have to re-understand it. And the Rishonim note that these are 2 different ways to understand this Gemara, both of which will lead to totally different conclusions regarding understanding the nature of the women's obligation. Okay? Option number 1, which is the way that I kind of read it, which is, we thought, what our hava amina, our initial thought was, women should be patur. Why? Because this is a mitzvah aseh shazman grama. It seems to be a time-bound mitzvah. And one understanding of the conclusion is, we were wrong. We thought it was a time-bound mitzvah, but really it's not. That's option number 1 to read the Gemara. There was a hava amina, a thought to say that it's time-bound because there are 3 different times the pasuk describes when to daven. And the Gemara's conclusion is going to be, no, we actually were wrong. We thought it was a time-bound mitzvah, but it's not. That's one way to read it. The other way to read this Gemara is to say, modification. You are correct that it is a time-bound mitzvah, but nevertheless, for a different reason, women are going to be obligated anyway. Okay? So the 2 ways to understand this, one conclusion could be, in the end, really this is not a time-bound mitzvah. We thought davening was a time-bound mitzvah. It's not, which we have to understand why, because at first glance it seems clearly to be a time-bound mitzvah. Or the conclusion is, you're right, it is a time-bound mitzvah, but because rachamei ninhu, because it's really also about asking for mercy, sometimes there are exceptions to the rule, right? We know that there are other mitzvah aseh shazman grama that women are sometimes obligated in. Anyone know, what's an example of another time-bound mitzvah that women are obligated even though it's a time-bound mitzvah? Shabbos, excellent. Many aspects of Shabbos. Arba minim, it's unclear. It seems like they're not obligated, but they're allowed to do it anyway. But what are some ones where they are obligated? Pesach, Daled Kosos, lighting Hanukkah candles, right? Megillah. There are situations where they're time-bound mitzvah, but for a different reason, what we call af hein ayu ba'otzo anes. They were also involved in the miracle, therefore they're obligated. When it comes to Shabbos, because women are obligated in what are called the mitzvot lo taseh of Shabbos, the negative commandments, they're also, says the Gemara, obligated in the positive commandments, even though those commandments are time-bound. Okay? So we have exceptions before, and perhaps that's another way to read this Gemara, that even though they're time-bound mitzvah, it's a time-bound mitzvah, nevertheless women are obligated. Yes?
You use the expression allowed to, but the Gemara actually doesn't say they're forbidden.
By which mitzvah?
By any was man brama. If
No, correct. No, you're raising something else. No, you're raising another point, which is even if women are patur, they may still be allowed to. But what we're talking about here, just to distinguish between the two, is there an obligation for them to? And that's what we're talking about. You are correct that even in situations where they are patur, like daled minim, like sukkah, if they want to, they're allowed to do the mitzvah, and there's a machlokes whether or not they can even say a bracha or not. Ashkenazim do, Sephardim generally do not. But that's a separate conversation from what we're talking about here, where by Megillah and by Hanukkah candles, they're obligated to do it, even though it's time-bound, because there's another reason that why we invoke an obligation. Okay, yes?
I thought that we don't really learn halachas from Tefilah.
No, excellent. We don't. Correct. What you're asking is something that we had noted before, that this pasuk of Erev Avoker V'Tzaharayim, which indicates time for tefillot. You're right. Well, one explanation is going to be, and that's the conclusion, which is this isn't actually a time-bound mitzvah, as we're going to see. The other one is going to say it is time-bound, but not because of this pasuk, but simply because of other factors, the way the Chazal established it. We'll get to that. Okay. So as we've seen, there's two different ways to read this Gemara. One way to read this Gemara is that the Gemara is concluding that that Tefilah is actually a mitzvah shelo hazman grama, that this is actually a mitzvah that is not time-bound. We have to explain why that would be. At first glance, there's times you're supposed to daven and times you're not supposed to daven. So how could that be? The other way to explain this Gemara is to say, yes, it is a time-bound mitzvah, but nevertheless, they're still going to be obligated because Tefilah is what we call rachmeininu. It's connecting to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's davening and asking for mercy, and therefore it'll be an exception where it's time-bound, but they are still obligated. Look at the second part of source number 3, Rashi. Rashi here, in the words v'chayavei bitfilah, Rashi seems to focus on what we would call the modification, where Rashi says, yes, we agree this is time-bound, but nevertheless, they're going to be obligated. Why? Because there's a focus on the fact that this isn't just about fulfilling an obligation, this is also about developing a connection. Says Rashi, Tefilah rachmeininu. They are obligated because Tefilah is ultimately about connecting to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and asking HaKadosh Baruch Hu for mercy. And therefore, even though it's time-bound, nevertheless, umidrabanan. And this is going to be, and the whole obligation of davening is rabbinic in nature, as we saw earlier. That's a big machlokas between the Rambam and the Ramban. So Rashi paskins like the Ramban that it is rabbinic in nature. V'tiknua af linashim ulechinuch tanim. And when the rabbis established the obligation, they established it both to women and to children at the age of chinuch. Even though it's time-bound, when the rabbis established the mitzvah of davening, they established the mitzvah to be not just for men, but to be for women as well. Okay, so that's one understanding. And we're going to see that this has ramifications, halachically. We'll get to them in 1 second. That's one understanding. If you look at the Rif and the Rambam, other Rishonim on the Gemara here, they're very, very clear that they understand the Gemara's maskana to have rejected the Havamina. Again, we're using methodological terminology, but they understand that when the Gemara concludes that women are obligated, it's because there was an initial thought that this is a mitzvah nasei shazman grama, and the conclusion of the Gemara is a rejection. No, you thought it was mitzvah nasei shazman grama, but it's actually not. And they're explicit in that. If you look at the Rif in source number 4, I underlined the part for you. The Rif says that they're obligated, Tefilah umezuzah ubirkat hamazon, davening and mezuzah and birkat hamazon, dahavele mitzvat aseh shelo hazman grama. Says the Rif very clearly, davening is under the category of mitzvot that are not time-bound. V'kol mitzvat aseh shelo hazman grama, nashim chayavot. And any mitzvah which is not time-bound, women are obligated, and therefore women are obligated to daven. He doesn't explain, but he says clearly that he understands Tefilah to be a non-time-bound mitzvah. The Rambam also follows this. And again, we're going to get to explain all of this in a second. It's just important to see the different opinions. Okay, so in source number 5, we have the Rambam. This is a Rambam that we've seen numerous times. This is one of our fundamental sources in general. We'll just read through Halacha Aleph again, how the Rambam outlines, the mitzvah of davening. Says the Rambam, mitzvah aseh lehitpalel kol yom. There is a positive commandment, biblical commandment, according to the Rambam, to daven every single day. Shene'emar, as the pasuk says, "V'avadetem et Hashem Elokechem." You should serve Hashem your God. Mipi hashmua lamdu she'avodah zu hi tefilah. we learn from a shmua, we've heard from, based on our tradition, that the word avodah here refers to tefillah. Shene'emar, as it says, uli avdo b'chol vavchem, elsewhere it says you should serve Hashem with all of your heart. Amru chachamim, this is a Gemara in Ta'anit. Ezu hi avodah shebelev, what is this inner avodah, this inner work, or this inner service? Zu tefillah. Continues the Rambam, ve'ein minyan hatfilot min haTorah, even though biblically there is a mitzvah to daven, the number of times you have to daven is not biblical. Ve'ein mishneh hatfilah hazot min haTorah, and the text, what you're supposed to say, is not min haTorah. Ve'ein litfilah zman kavua min haTorah, and there is no set time to daven according to the Torah. Therefore, continues the Rambam, ulefikach, therefore, halacha bet, nashim ve'avadim chayavim v'tfilah lefi shehi mitzvat aseh shelo hazman grama. Therefore, women and avadim and servants are chayav in tefillah because it is considered to be a mitzvah aseh shelo hazman grama. Now, you may have noticed the Rambam actually he doesn't explicitly explain it, but he does explain himself. Did anyone pick up on why, according to the Rambam, this would be considered a mitzvah aseh shelo hazman grama? Exactly. Because at the end of Halacha Aleph, what did the Rambam say? There's a mitzvah to daven biblically, but there's no set time when you have to daven. Once a day, whenever you want, whatever you want, in whatever way you want to. And therefore, what the Rambam is really explaining is how he understands the conclusion of the Gemara. The Pasuk had said, Erev Oker v'Tzaharayim. And therefore the Gemara assumed that maybe there was a biblical obligation to daven at certain times. Kamash Malan, what is the conclusion of the Gemara? No. As you pointed out, we don't learn from the Tehillim. The Tehillim might have been a reference to what we're supposed to do, or maybe what Chazal used later on to institute 3 times a day. But Mid'oraisa, biblically, you only have to daven once a day. And therefore, says the Rambam, it now falls under the category of being a mitzvah aseh shelo hazman grama, and therefore women are obligated. Yes. Yes and no. No, there is something. So you're making a very good point. Meaning, what you're basically saying is even if the time is only rabbinic, that should also be considered a mitzvah hashesh hazman grama. So that is it's a question, and there's a whole conversation about that. But what we're going to see soon is that again, when we're talking now at least about it from the perspective, according to the Rambam, at least midoraisa, they're only obligated to do once a day. And if that's the fundamental obligation, that when the rabbis instituted everything else, that no longer applied to the women. That's what we're going to see soon. Meaning, if the rabbis had instituted that they needed to daven, then you're right. But what the conclusion of the Rambam is basically, they have to daven once a day, and all those other aspects that are rabbinic in nature that are limiting would make it zman grama. Those don't apply to women, according to the Rambam. Okay, sorry. Yes, I saw another question. Yes, no. So again, according to the Rambam, the whole conversation about the tefillot corresponding to the avos and all that, we've discussed it in the past. Basically, that's all rabbinic. That's all d'Rabbanan. Meaning, what the Gemara was basically saying, according to the Rambam, that the Chazal instituted all of the 3 tefillot corresponding to the avot and to the korbanot. Or another way of saying it is, some explain, the avos did daven 3 times a day. But our halacha doesn't come from the avos, as we explained that. We saw an opinion that says, right, nitna Torah v'nitchadsha halacha. When the Torah was given, everything changed. So it could be everything is patterned after the avot, but the obligation, at least according to the Rambam, to daven 3 times a day is fully d'Rabbanan and not midoraisa. Yes. Excellent. So good. True. According to the Rambam, midoraisa, there's no such thing. According to the Rambam, on a biblical level, there is no such thing for anybody. Meaning, according to the Rambam, the mitzvah d'oraisa to daven is whenever you want, whatever you want. Come the rabbis, and they established all different types of rules for good reason. And therefore the men, midrabanan, have those obligations. But according to the Rambam, those obligations, when they were instituted by the rabbis, were not meant to be instituted, at least from a halachic, from an obligatory perspective, on women. That's the Rambam's perspective. Okay, so I'm going to just to explain this a little bit more. What the Achronim, in conversing and discussing these 2 opinions, they basically say the following 2 opinions come out. This is the 2 main opinions. We have the opinion of the Rambam and the Rif that we saw, which is that davening tefillah is d'oraisa. If tefillah is d'oraisa to begin with, as the Rambam explicitly says, that d'oraisa is only once a day when you want to, however you want to. And therefore that applies to men and to women just as much because it's lo zman grama. Later on, Chazal came and instituted that for the men, there's obligations. You have to do it 3 times a day. There's a limitation to when you daven, all different aspects. And when Chazal instituted those things, they didn't apply them to the women as well. And therefore, what remains right now is basically for women, the fundamental biblical obligation. The men are going to have 3 times a day by a certain time, and the women have the mitzvah d'oraisa to daven once a day. This is according to the Rambam. Okay, that's according to the Rambam. Now, there's 2 ways that people understand the Rambam. Some say what the Rambam means is that the women should say when they say they should daven once a day, it means they should daven a proper Shmona Esrei once a day. But you can choose. It could be shacharis, it could be mincha, it could be at any point in the day. It doesn't have to. You don't need both. Others say no. They will take their Rambam even further. They say no. According to the Rambam, you don't even need to say Shmona Esrei. They could say any short tefillah that they want to say. Now, if you look at the Rambam in continuation of Halacha Bet does outline that every tefillah needs to have 3 parts to it, as we've discussed in the past. It needs to start with praise, shevach. It needs to then go on, continue to what's called bakasha, which is request, and end with hoda'ah, with thanks, which is the outline of our Shmona Esrei. So the Rambam is clear that whatever tefillah a person is going to say, that tefillah once a day, needs to have those 3 aspects. But say some of the Achronim, that doesn't have to be. It's true that Shmona Esrei qualifies. It doesn't have to be Shmona Esrei. What if a woman can't do it or she doesn't want to? Some understand the Rambam to be saying any tefillah that includes those 3 components would qualify as davening once a day, and a woman would fulfill her obligation with that. This is the most lenient opinion regarding women's obligation, which would be she could wake up in the morning, she could say Birkot TORAH, she could say Birkot HaShachar, which all have those 3 components, and that would be good enough. Even, by the way, we haven't even gotten to situations where a woman might be busy with something else. We're talking about a teenager. A teenager gets up, she has no other obligations in the world. If she, according to this opinion within the Rambam, if all she wants to do is say Birkot HaTorah, she fulfills her obligation of davening that day. That is at least one the lenient understanding of the Rambam. The more strict understanding of the Rambam is that a woman should at least say Shmona Esrei at least once a day. It could be in the morning, it could be in the afternoon, but it should be proper Shmona Esrei. Those are the 2 understandings of the Rambam. The other opinion we have is Rashi and the Ramban. Their opinion is that davening is d'Rabbanan to begin with. There never was a biblical obligation to daven. It was always d'Rabbanan, right? This is the argument we saw between the Rambam and the Ramban. And therefore, who established the obligation to daven to begin with? Chazal, the rabbis. And when the rabbis established the obligation to daven, they established it equally for men and women. When they established the obligation to daven, they established a time to daven. They established how many times a day you need to daven. And that was established equally for men and women, even though it's man grama, because since the purpose of this is to ask for rachmim from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Chazal established it to be equal for men and women. I want to just show this to you. We can read it inside because it's really explained beautifully in source number 8 by the Mishnah Berurah. The Mishnah Berurah, which is one of the main halachic sources in source number 8. We're skipping 6 and 7 just for times. We did it outside. So the Mishnah Berurah in source number 8, written by the Chafetz Chaim, is a super commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. It's one of the main halachic sources for us today in terms of how we paskin. Source number 8 says the Mishnah Berurah is commenting on the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch had said that that davening is a mitzvah to say shelo hazman grama, and therefore women are obligated. Says the Mishnah Berurah, source number 8, Dalid, Kol ze lidat harambam. This is all according to the Rambam. Sherak zmanei hatfilah he midivrei sofrim. Because only the times of davening is derabanan. Aval ikar mitzvah hatfilah he min haTorah. But according to the Rambam, the main mitzvah to daven is biblical, is midoraisa. V'kasav ha'Magen Avram. She'al pi svarazu, the Magen Avram says, the Mishnah Berurah is quoting another commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, that according to this logic, nahagu rov hanashim, many women have the custom, she'en mitpalelim yud chet bitmidut shachar ve'erev. They don't daven Shmona Esrei every single day. Shachar and Erev here, we assume it means morning and afternoon, because we're going to get to, because Mariv is obviously a separate conversation. Why? Lefi she'omrot miyad baboker, samuch l'netilah, what do the women do instead? They don't have time, or for whatever reason they don't say it. What do they do instead? They wake up in the morning, they say a short tefillah that includes includes shevach, bakasha, and hoda'ah. And at least according to the Rambam, they have now fulfilled their obligation to daven midoraisa. Ve'efshar she'av chachamim lo chivu yoter. And according to this understanding, even when the rabbis came and established times to daven and specific zmanim by which you need to daven, that wasn't applied to the women. Continues the Mishnah Berurah explaining the other side, the other opinion. Aval dat haramban she'ikar mitzvat tefilah hi midivrei sofrim. According to the Ramban, who says there is no biblical mitzvah to daven every single day. Even initially, the mitzvah to daven is only rabbinic in nature. Shehem anshe knesset hagedolah. Who established it? The anshe knesset hagedolah shetiknu yudchet brachot al aseder, because they established Shmona Esrei lehitpalel otan shacharit umincha chova ve'arvit reshut. They told us, and they established, when they established the commandment to daven, they also included the commandment to daven shacharit, mincha, and as we saw, arvit, which is fundamentally a reshut. V'af al pi shehu mitzvat aseh midivrei sofrim shehazman grama, and even though it is a time-bound mitzvah, v'hanashim p'turot mikol mitzvat aseh shehazman grama afilu midivrei sofrim, and even though generally women are patur from mitzvah sheish hazman grama, kigon kiddush halevana, like kiddush levana. I don't know why he brought that example, but that is an example of a time-bound mitzvah which women are not obligated in, kiddush levana. Afal pikein chivu otam b'tfilot shacharit umincha kimo anashim hoel v'tfilah hi bakashat rachamim. The reason, according to the Ramban, why women are obligated is even though it's time-bound, because this is not just about fulfilling the mitzvah, it's about asking HaKadosh Baruch Hu for rachamim, for mercy. It's about developing a relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Therefore, women were obligated as well. And so that is the summary of the opinions. Okay, so what we've seen so far, and just to say it outside, is we have three major opinions. There are many more, but we're just going to focus on the three major opinions regarding women's obligation to daven without taking into account any other potential factors. Okay, we're talking about women who have time, women who don't have any other responsibilities. There are three main opinions regarding their obligation. The most, what we would call stringent opinion, is that of what is understood to be the Ramban, which is that women are obligated to daven twice a day, Shmona Esrei, Mincha, and Shacharit. Again, Mariv, the assumption is since Mariv, as we discussed last class, started out as a Reshut, even when the men accepted upon themselves to daven Mariv, the women did not accept that upon themselves, and therefore there is no obligation. They're certainly welcome to daven Mariv, but the fundamental obligation is that according to the Ramban, women should daven Mincha and Shacharit, Shmona Esrei, every single day. That's what's understood to be the opinion of the Ramban. Then we have the opinion of the Rambam. The Rambam we know is more lenient, but there are two ways that the poskim understand the Rambam. The middle approach is that the Rambam believes they should daven Shmona Esrei once a day, either Shacharit or Mincha, but it should be Shmona Esrei. It should be a proper tefillah. Because again, according to the Rambam, there's no mitzvah sheish hazman grama. The davening tefillah does not have it; it's not time bound, and that's why women are obligated. But it should be a proper tefillah that includes Shmona Esrei. And the third, most lenient opinion is, according to within the Rambam, which is that no, as long as they say any tefillah at some point during the day that includes shevach, bakasha, and hoda'ah, that includes praise, request, and thanks, that will fulfill the women's obligation to daven. Okay, so that is the general. Those are the three opinions. If you look here at the end of the first paragraph of source number 8, the Mishnah Berurah suggests what he believes. It's the end of the underlined part in source number 8, the first paragraph. V'chein ikar. Chein ikar means he holds like the Ramban. The Mishnah Berurah paskins like the most stringent approach, which is that women should fundamentally daven Shmona Esrei, Mincha, and Shacharit every single day. Again, we're not taking into account other factors right now. V'chein ikar, chichein das rov ha-poskim, because that is the opinion of most poskim. V'chein ichriya b'sefer Shagas Aryeh, and he brings a quote from a different sefer, from the shut of the Shagas Aryeh. Al kein yesh lazhir l'nashim sheyitpalalu yudchet, and therefore says the Chafetz Chaim, in Mishnah Berurah, he recommends that we should instruct the women in our communities that they should be davening Shmona Esrei, Shacharit, and Mincha. Continues, by the way, the Mishnah Berurah, and he talks about Shema. We haven't discussed Shema. We're not really going to discuss Shema, but it's interesting to see this quote here. We saw earlier that the Mishnah says very clearly that women are not obligated in Shema. Why are they not obligated in Shema? Because that's clearly a time-bound mitzvah. But says the Mishnah Berurah, ideally we should encourage them to say Shema as well. Nachon gam kein sheyikablu alehem ol malchut shamayim. Ideally, women should also try to accept upon themselves the yoke of heaven. Dahainu sheyamru al kol panim Shema Yisrael, that they should say Shema Yisrael. They should say the 3 paragraphs of Shema. Ideally, if they can't do that, then at least the first pasuk. But ideally, the 3 paragraphs. And then he discusses Birko Kriyat Shema, the brachot surrounding Shema, which is a totally different conversation. Okay, so those are the 3. We have the 3 opinions. We see that at least according to the Mishnah Brura, which is really one of the main authoritative sources. He says that women really should be davening twice a day. That seems to be the main approach. Regarding the Sephardi poskim, we're going to skip a couple of sources, and we're going to come back to them in 1 minute. But if you look to source number 14 is a shoot Sheila v'tshuva for Rav Ben Zion Abba Shaul, who is one of the main Sephardi poskim. Source number 14, he was asked his opinion regarding women's obligation in davening, and he asked the following: She'ela, ha'im nashim chayavot litpalel et kol hatfilot, v'ha'im chayavot lomar et kol seder hatfilah? Are women obligated to daven all of the tefillot, and do they have to say it in the same text? And says Rav Ben Zion Abba Shaul, nashim chayavot litpalel b'kol yom tfilat shacharit v'tfilat mincha. They should say shacharit and mincha. Uvayom sheyesh bo musaf, and if there is a day where there's musaf as well, chayavot gam b'tfilat musaf. That's a whole different conversation. We're focusing more on shacharit and mincha today. V'tfilat arvit einan chayavot litpalel. Umikol makom im yichalot tov shetetpalel na gam kein tfilat arvit. And he says they're not obligated in arvit if they can. Matov v'manayim, and it would be good for them to do it. So Rav Ben Zion Abba Shaul seems to clearly paskin just like the Mishnah Brura. However, there is another Sephardi posik. If you turn to source number 15, Rav Avadia Yosef is much more makil. Yes, we're going to get to that. No, absolutely. I'm skipping that on purpose because that is a specific, we're going to get to that in a second. Right now I wanted to talk about what's the obligation for women who have time. Meaning, all things being equal, what is the fundamental obligation? And then we're going to get to that next line. Yes, we're going to get to that. I skipped that on purpose because I want to just first set up, what's the fundamental obligation. Okay? Meaning there are some, you'll see Rav Avadia right now is going to say, even women who have time, they don't have to daven twice a day. Meaning, some are makil on women regardless of other factors. The Chafetz Chaim is not, and we saw Rabbi Zion Abba Shaul is not. But look at Rav Avadia, source number 15. Ha'ikar kedivrei ha'achronim hanir la'el sheledat harif ve'harambam umaran. He says, if you look at the Rif, and you look at the Rambam, and you look at Maran, who's Maran in the Sephardi world? The Shulchan Aruch. He says, if you look very clearly, they all paskin dai lenashim b'tfilah achat she'ibn Torah. They only did daven once. They only need to say it once, which again he doesn't explain, but it seems like he understands it to be tfilat Shmona Esrei, the middle approach that we mentioned, which is Shmona Esrei one time a day. V'chein ikar. So Rav Avadia, so we saw that the Mishnah Brura, the Chafetz Chaim, and Rav Ben Zion Abba Shaul were the most stringent that women need to daven. Again, all things being equal, no other time constraints. They should daven twice a day. And we see Rav Avadia Yosef, who says, no, even women who have time, really fundamentally the obligation is only going to be once a day. And then he quotes that he's disagreeing with Rabbi Zion Abba Shaul. Okay, this was all just understanding the general understanding, which is assuming women are, let's say, similar to a situation with men where they have no unusual obligations. That would be the situation regarding their obligation. Of course, as we know, women have many more obligations than men do. And the nature of those obligations is more complex, and as a result, interestingly enough, even though explicitly in the halacha, the petur or the special heterim for women is not necessarily found. We're going to see it's only found in the later achronim, discussing that the minhag was for women not to, and then the poskim try to understand why that is. Okay, this is a very unusual situation, which is that often when we're dealing with specific heterim, the poskim will initially say they don't have to do it or they do have to do it. Here you have a situation where all of the poskim are looking around and they're saying, we see many women are not davening. If you look at the Gemara and you look at the Mishnah and you look at the classic sources, it seems that women are obligated, and yet we know, if we look around, that women, especially mothers, are generally not davening. Why is that? And so they then try to understand and come up with halachic justifications for what we're seeing, because as we know, minhag Yisrael is not to be taken lightly. So look at source number. It begins with source number. Sorry, 1 second. Let me find it. Source number 10. Sorry, source number 11. Sorry, we're going a little back and forth here. Source number 11 is a pretty famous tshuva by the Divrei Yatziv. The Divrei Yatziv was written by the Yekusiel Yehuda Halberstam, the Kloisenberger Rebbe. The Kloisenberger Rebbe, we're talking about the Kloisenberger Rebbe, who himself is really a fascinating story in and of himself. He was a survivor of the Holocaust. His wife and 10 children were all killed in the Holocaust. Eventually, he moved to America, eventually settled here in Netanya, got remarried. I believe he had 7 children, and really established what is known as Kiryat Sanz in Netanya, which is really an empire. They built the famous hospital, Laniado Hospital. It's a beautiful area. I myself lived in Netanya for 7 years and lived right near that area. It's really incredible what they were able to build. So aside from building in a very, very strong community known as the Sanz Kloisenberg community, he also was a huge Talmid Chacham. And he has many sheilot v'tshuvot. And this is one of the more famous tshuvot that is quoted in many of the modern poskim. And he's trying to understand why it is that we see in our communities that women are not davening, or at least not davening to the same extent that seems to be outlined in the halacha. And he gives 2 justifications. Source number 11. V'ulai yesh lomar od. Maybe we could make a suggestion. Lefi ma shekasavnu. There's a lot of rashi tevot, so I'm just going to read it. But you don't have to, if you don't understand every single word, don't worry. B'siif ayin b'siman ayin sif dalid deha osek b'tzorchei rabim lo yafsek. We have a cloud that if a person is involved in something that is for the community, that is important for the community, sometimes he might be putter from certain other obligations. So says the Divrei Yatziv based on that. Mikol makom yesh makom gadol lomar. Shenashim, women, sheyesh lahem banim ktanim. They have young children, v'tipulam alehem, and taking care of them is incumbent upon the women. Chasheshu sha'al yedei tfilatam. The women realized, they just came to the conclusion, sha'al yedei, if they were to focus on their davening, lo yuchlu litapel bahem kira'oi. They wouldn't be able to properly take care of their children. If they had on their head zman tefillah and this and all that, they wouldn't be able to take care of their children. V'havei ke'osek b'mitzvah upater mi-mitzvah. It is like a famous klal that we have. We have a rule that if a person is involved in one mitzvah, he or she is pater from the other mitzvah. Now there's a lot of different rules regarding where that applies and which mitzvah that apply to. But says Divrei Yatziv, that would seem to be what's happening here. The women are involved in running the household, they're involved in taking care of the children, and they're oseg b'mitzvah, they're involved in a mitzvah, and therefore they're going to be putter from another mitzvah. Now again, it's important to know that he doesn't say it here, but the obvious understanding, and I'm sure, I'm not a woman, but I'm sure the women can explain this, and just from seeing my wife and how she runs the household, we're not simply just talking about the fact that during the time when they're supposed to daven. We're talking about being a mother means you're constantly thinking about your children, you're constantly thinking about your family, because you could say, well, they get the kids out of school and then they have time. What's the big deal? Okay, meaning there's so many. If we're talking about minutes here, then we can come up with a technical argument. The assumption is that women who are raising a home, raising children in a home, they're constantly busy with that. And therefore, the nature of that is taking up their mental energy, that is taking up their thoughts, that is taking up so much of what they're doing. And as a result, even though maybe technically they can find the time to say the few words, the assumption seems to be that they are that in their headspace and in their ability to balance all of the different needs and responsibilities, that is why they are in davening. Now again, we're going to see soon that even according to this, they should still daven something. They should still try to say maybe Birkot TORAH or Birkot HaShachar, even maybe at least rely on the lenient opinion that we saw earlier, which is to say something. But that is why, says the Divrei Yatziv, they're not doing more. Then he keeps going. Ach al zeh yesh la'ir. But he says, wait a second, I'm still a little bit confused. Shekevan, we're in the first paragraph in source number 11, right after the 3 dots. Kevan shestama deshas ka'amar chayavim. But wait a second, he says, if you look at the Gemara seems very clear that they're obligated, and no one says otherwise in the Gemara and in the Rishonim. How can we go against the Gemara? How can we stand here and say, oseg mitzvah, pater min mitzvah, if the Gemara and the Rishonim don't mention it? So says the Divrei Yatziv, I'm going to give another suggestion why I think women may be pater from davening when they're involved in raising a family. And he says, I'm going to give you another reason, because there is a rule, I'm going to say it outside just for time purposes, in the second paragraph, this is what he says in the second paragraph in source number 11, there is a rule, and it's a Gemara in Eruvin, that if a person is about to daven, he should first look at himself and ask himself whether or not he is capable of properly davening with kavanah. And if he's not, then he shouldn't daven. So says the Divrei Yatziv, based on our understanding that it's not just about obligation, but it's about if you're about to daven, you should first make sure that you're able to concentrate. Says the Divrei Yatziv, even though nowadays we don't necessarily rely on this, because many of us are not fully capable of davening, fundamentally, he says, we know that women who are involved in raising a family, they're what we would call they're distracted. They're involved in so many other and therefore, says the Divrei Yatziv, we're not going to obligate them. Okay? Obviously, I want to clarify. Any woman who feels that she is able to daven, that she is able to daven shacharit, daven mincha, in addition to all of the various responsibilities. No one's saying that she shouldn't. We're just explaining that part of why we now see that many women don't have the minhag not to. It's based on this understanding that the concept of osek b'mitzvah patur min mitzvah, that they're involved in one mitzvah and therefore they are no longer obligated in the other, or based on this assumption that they have so many responsibilities which are hard for them to carry out and to then also be able to properly concentrate on their tefillah, and therefore we tell them to say something short. They should say a short tefillah, whatever they could say that day, and that is enough for them to be able to be yotzei, or what they're basically doing is they're relying on the most lenient opinion given their current life circumstances. That is source number 11. This is quoted as well in source number 12, the Piskei Tshuvos, which is a modern day sefer, summarizes all the different poskim of today. He also mentions this, and the other famous source regarding this issue is source number 13. Source number 13 it's in the footnotes of the Piskei Tshuvos, and it's a fascinating source because it's not explicit, but it's very, very interesting. Source number 13. Heviu Sefer Sichot HaChafetz Chaim, in a book called Sichot of the Chafetz Chaim, essays or lectures by the Chafetz Chaim, in Chelek Aleph Ot Chav Zayin, Kotev Bino Reb Aryeh Lev, the son of the Chafetz Chaim, Aryeh Lev, is quoted as saying the following: I Mizal, my mother, Kimat V'lo Hitpalala Kol Zman Shelo Yatzanu Mitachat Yadeha. My mother never davened. He's basically saying, my mother, when she was raising us, she never davened. Be'amrali, and she told me, ki avi patra mizeh. And she told me that my father told her she was patur, mishum shi oseket begidul baneh, because she is involved in raising children. Now, why is this important? We saw earlier, what else did the Chafetz Chaim say? The Chafetz Chaim is the author of the text of the Mishnah Berurah. What did the Mishnah Berurah conclude earlier? That fundamentally, he was the most machmir. Fundamentally, women are obligated to daven twice a day. What's clear is that was only in an ideal situation, or I want to call it ideal, in a situation where they don't have other things. That same Chafetz Chaim, at least according to what has been told, mipi hashmua, based on this story, that same Chafetz Chaim, so we know this is somebody who obviously felt that women should fundamentally be davening, still told his wife that when she's involved in raising the children, she does not have the obligation to daven. The assumption, again, it doesn't say it here, is that she said some kind of tefillah in the morning, even though it wasn't the classic tefillah. Yes?
This isn't the halach that I'm going to say anymore.
That's okay.
I think mothers of children, especially working, are constantly davening in a relationship.
Absolutely. Again, and I'm glad that you're mentioning that. I agree with you 100%. One of the reasons that we opened up before we started our halakha conversation, which was before we began this halakha conversation, I didn't want to just start by talking the halakha obligation. I wanted to talk about the title of the class is Women in Tefilah. It's not about women's obligation to Tefilah, and there is no doubt that the relationship and connection between women and Tefilah is deep. And by the way, we haven't gotten to this yet, but there is a concept of davening that isn't within the context of Shmona Esrei and 3 times a day. There's saying Tehillim. There's in the world of Chassidut called Hitbodedut, where you talk to Hashem. There's so many other, and that is 100% correct. Our focus today, for lack of is because we've been focusing more on the general concept of what we know as classic tefillah. That's what I'm focusing on. But I don't mean to imply that women are not davening in other ways, and the tefillah that they say, and the tehillim that they say when they light. We talked about, it says in the beginning, we talked about the tefillah they say after they light Shabbos candles. There's no question. And by the way, I would even say more than that. I want to also add to that, which is regarding this whole question of are they obligated to say davening, or are they to daven technically, or are they obligated to say Shema? Part of the reason that many poskim comment that maybe we're more lenient by women than by men is also because, again, I don't want to get, this can be considered somewhat controversial. I don't think it is, because of the difference in nature between men and women. And there's a certain inherent, deeper spiritual connection that women have, even when they're not necessarily davening, that men might need davening in order to tap into that spiritual connection. It doesn't mean they can't. It doesn't mean they shouldn't. It just means it's not needed. And I think that's touching upon what you're saying, which is that women, in the way they are and who they are and how they interact, are very often naturally more connected either through actual tefillah or just through their relationship, and that could be why, in general, we're more lenient than we would be in other ways. Yes, one more comment, and then we'll end.
Women generally also teach their children to daven.
Absolutely.
So in that process, they themselves are davening.
Excellent. True. Also true. Meaning, again, there's lots of different ways that this is, and it's very, very important. That's actually what I want to end with. I want to end with just one final comment by. This is a comment by the Sefer Pnei Halacha of Eliezer Melamed in source number 17. Source number 17, again, our conversation today has been regarding the halachic obligation, but I specifically don't want to focus just on that. That's why we opened with a conversation regarding the deep connection, how the source of many of our halachot of davening, the source comes from Chana. And many of our models of tefillah and Sefer Bereshit are the imahot. It's clear that there is a deep connection between women and tefillah. We discussed today the focus on what is the strict obligation regarding davening, and we saw that there were three main opinions. We saw the opinion of the Ramban, who says that they're obligated, seems to be they're obligated twice a day, shachrit and mincha, to daven shmona esrei. We saw the opinion of the Rambam, which is that they are not as obligated. It's a machlokes whether it means that they're only obligated once a day to say shmona esrei, or they might not be obligated at all to say shmona esrei. They're only obligated to say some kind of tefillah once a day. We saw that many of the modern poskim seem to encourage, or generally say ideally a woman should daven twice a day. That seems to be the approach in an ideal situation. Although there are some poskim that say that they can rely on the Rambam and daven either once a day or just a short tefillah. And of course, we saw many modern day poskim who know that women who are involved in child rearing or other types of activities connected to the running of the household have a special pitur or a special heter, even though it's clear that they're going to be intimately connected through tefillah and various other ways. Regarding the strict obligation of tefillah 2 or 3 times a day, they have a reason to be patur. I just want to end with, which I think is a beautiful point that Rabbi Melamed makes regarding the power and unique power of women's tefillah, specifically because they don't have the same obligations as men regarding how and when tefillah needs to be. Source number 17, well, just 2 more minutes. Al pi ma shelamadnu. Efshar lahavin, we're in source number 17. Efshar lahavin et mashma'uta shel tefillat nashim. Based on what we've been learning, we can now understand the meaning of the tefillah of women. Shnei yisodot ba'im lidei bitoy betefillah. Ha'echad ishi v'hasheni klali. There are 2 aspects that come to that come about through davening, that are expressed through davening. One is personal, and one is communal. Ha'ishi hu ha'pniya shel adam el mekor chayav el Hashem elokav u'bakashat harachamim milefanav. The personal is when a person turns to the source of his life, to Hashem, his God, and asks mercy from him. V'ha'yesod ha'klali, the collective, the national aspect, or the communal aspect, balatet bitoy lekesher ha'kavod shebein klal Yisrael Hashem. The communal aspect expressed through davening bitzibor expresses the unique connection between Am Yisrael and Hashem. V'ayedei kach lekadish et shemo shel Hashem be'olam. And through that, by bringing God's name, honoring God's name in the world. We're just going to skip to the second paragraph. Li'itim yeshno metach misuyam ben hayesod ha'klali liyesod ha'ishi. Sometimes you have some kind of conflict or stress or something that where one pulls the other. Many people have commented how the pace of davening in a shul prevents them from davening more slowly. Sometimes, right, there's going to be some kind of conflict between personal tefillah and communal tefillah. I have to daven by a certain time. I have to daven with this tzibor. That can sometimes impact the personal nature of the tefillah. Lumat zot. He says, but if we think about women's tefillah, which sometimes doesn't have as many of those restrictions, that enables them to then be able to elevate and focus on the personal aspect of tefillah. B'tfilat nashim bolet yoter hayisod ha'ishi, the personal connection. Shehoel v'ha'isha p'tura mikol mitzvot hatzluyot bazman. Lefikach eina tzricha lomar pesukei zimra. They're not obligated in pesukei zimra v'kriyat shema. Again, they're welcome to, but they're not obligated. V'kol shara dvarim she'agvarim omrim. As opposed to all the other things that men need to say. Gam nam nashim tzrichot litpalel benusach shmona esrei kivi shetiknu anshe knesset hagadola ela shahoil v'seder tfilat hachovah shelen katzar yoter. Since their fundamental obligation is shorter, it enables them to have more personal expression in what they say and what they don't say. Memela יש פחות חשש שהשגרה תשחק את הכוונתם. There's less of a concern that the routine is going to hurt their tefillah because they have more leeway for personal expression. They don't have to say everything in the tefillah. They can choose to say this, focus on the things that speak to them more. Okay, and if you go just the last paragraph, בנוסף לכך, כיוון שאישה אינה צריכה להתפלל בבית כנסת ובמניין, since women are not obligated, everything we've been talking about is only regarding the need to daven. They are not obligated to daven with a minyan. ממילא היא יכולה לקבוע את תפילתה בזמן שבו תרגיש שתוכל לכוון יותר. Women now have the flexibility to daven at a moment and a time and in a place that is ideal for them. וכן קצב תפילתה אינו מוגבל על ידי קצב תפילת הציבור. And the pace is no longer limited or dependent on the pace of the community. מכל זה יוצא שבתפילת האישה בולט יותר צד התחנונים האישי. Therefore, the focus for tefillah of women can tend to be on the more personal aspect of tefillah. Now, I want to just stress, he's not saying that women shouldn't come to davening and they shouldn't be in the tzibur. Any woman who finds that tefillah b'tzibur is more meaningful for her and that that is something that she finds meaningful, absolutely you should be coming to the shul and expressing it in any way that is meaningful for you. But what he's pointing out is that even women who are obligated, because there is a certain flexibility, it enables the women to focus more on her personal tefillah and has less of that tension between the personal and the communal that is found, at least for the obligation of men, who have all these obligations of when they need to do it by and how they need to do it and where they need to do it. And I just thought that really, I felt that just, it captures beautifully a different perspective on this entire conversation of women in tefillah, which is that it's not that women in tefillah is any less, it's just that women in tefillah is different. Different in a unique way and in a special way. And there's a flexibility here where women can involve themselves as much as they want as men, with a minyan 3 times a day, if that is what's meaningful for them. But there's also that built-in flexibility to express it differently, which I think is meaningful. Just because of time, I'm not going to take questions because I'm already a little bit over, but I'm happy to answer questions personally. I apologize, I went a couple of minutes over, but thank you all. Wishing everybody a wonderful week.